All right. Quote, Hamlet of democratic socialism, end quote, question mark. Israel Getzler. Martov, a political biography of a Russian social democrat. So here we go. Martov failed. Left-wing critics such as Sukhanov, Lunacharsky, Radek, Trotsky, and Charles Rappaport believe they have detected in Martov's character a, quote, Hamletism, a paralysis of willpower fatal in a revolutionary. Unable to attribute his failure to cowardice, Martov's exceptional courage could not be impugned. They explain his irresolution, vacillations, and weakness in action by reference to his exaggerated intellectualism, his paralyzing ability to perceive all sides and dimensions of a question, and to understand with sympathy the minds and purposes of his opponents. Sukhanov sums up Martov's plight as, quote, woe from wit. Quote, he was too intelligent to be a first-class revolutionary, end quote. While Trotsky, more harshly dismissing Martov as, quote, the major failure of the revolution, end quote, and describes Martov as, quote, the Hamlet of democratic socialism, end quote. Quote, his thought lacked the mainspring of will, end quote. Trotsky. What's out there? Wikipedia says Nikolai Sukhanov lived from 1882 to 1940 and was a Russian Menshevik internationalist and chronicler of the Russian Revolution. On the 29th of June 1940, he was convicted on false charges by the Soviet government and shot. After Stalin's death, he was rehabilitated. Back to the text. Radek laments Martov as the, quote, most sincere and selfless representative of the once revolutionary petty bourgeoisie, end quote. Radek. While Lunacharsky blames Martov's subtle and over-sophisticated intellect for his aversion from and rejection of the, quote, elemental and crude ... sweep, end quote, of the revolution. Critics from the right, on the other hand, such as E.K. Kuskova and P. Rice of the Cadets and Mark Vishniak of the Socialist Revolutionaries, fasten on Martov's orthodox Marxism. E.K. Kuskova. Yekaterina Kuskova was a Russian Empire economist, journalist, and politician working in founding both the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party and the Liberal Constitutional Democratic Party. She was an advocate of social reformism and opposed the Bolsheviks. I'm not seeing anything for this P. Rice. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this person. And Mark Vishniak. Wikipedia says Mark Vishniak was an American socialist journalist and writer working for Time magazine. He lived from 1883 to 1976. What are you dogs doing over there? Back to the text. Critics from the right blame Martov's narrow dogmatism and a measure of fanaticism for Martov's failure to see the real Russia and act upon observed facts instead of inherited ideas. So the charge against Martov, if we ignore Radek's facile class-based explanation, is that Martov was too intellectual, parenthesis, Sukhanov, end parenthesis, lacked the will to action and power, parenthesis, Trotsky and Rappaport, had too many scruples, Lunacharsky, and was too doctrinaire, Kuskova, Rice, and Vishniak. Let me look up this Rappaport real quick. Charles. Charles Rappaport lived from 1865 to 1941 and was a Russian and French militant, communist politician, journalist and writer, a Jewish intellectual, and a multilingual scholar. He's been referred to as, quote, a grand man of French radicalism, end quote. Back to the text. Much of the Bolsheviks' criticism of Martov may spring from a sentiment ranging from sad regret, Lunacharsky, Radek, Rappaport, to bitter disappointment, Trotsky and Lenin, that Martov refused to throw in his lot with them. Footnote. For Lenin's dream of an alliance with Martov in 1917 and after, see Lunacharsky and Krupskaya. And footnote. Footnote. It shows as early as during the Shilgunov funeral of 1891, when he ceded leadership to Yakamansky as a matter of course in his role on Iskra and as leader of the Menshevik Party, all characterized by a yearning for collective leadership and above all by his refusal in 1917 to join up with Tseretelli during the period of the provisional government and with Lenin after October and share power. End footnote. But it has its point. At crucial moments after the Second Congress of 1903, early in 1908, at and after the Paris Plenum of 1910, and above all in 1917, Martov was irresolute, slow to decide, unclear or at least unsimple in his policies. But even if all this be granted, that Martov was very much the intellectual, Sukhanov assures us that he was the most intelligent man he ever met, and was singularly deficient in ambition for power, that great decision-maker and go to action. Excuse me, sorry, I had to turn something off on my computer. Where the hell am I? But even if all this be granted, that Martov was very much the intellectual, Sukhanov assures us that he was the most intelligent man he ever met, and was singularly deficient in ambition for power, that great decision-maker and go to action. The question remains whether these characteristics alone, or to a large measure, suffice to explain Martov's failure. I do not think they do. Martov, courageous, passionate, and essentially a political activist with a revolutionary temperament, would have overcome his personal deficiencies and indifference to power if this had been demanded by Martov's social democratic beliefs. Footnote. Even Trotsky, Martov's only uncharitable critic, if one ignores the outrageous entry in something in Russian, as late as in 1922, grudgingly granted Martov a revolutionary instinct. Earlier, during the dramatic debate of the Grimm affair at the First Congress of Soviets, 3rd of June 1917, Trotsky had rallied to Martov with the cry, "Long live the honest revolutionary Martov." The hell's the Grimm affair? Wikipedia says the Grimm-Hoffmann affair was a short-lived scandal that threatened Switzerland's neutrality during World War I. Robert Grimm, a socialist politician, traveled to the Russian Republic as an activist to negotiate a separate peace between Russia and the German Empire in order to end the war on the Eastern Front in the interest of socialism. When the Allies discovered the proposed peace deal, Robert Grimm had to return home. Arthur Hoffmann, the Swiss federal councillor who had supported Grimm, had to resign. Back to the text and footnote. But the seizure of power was not what those beliefs demanded. Martov had many good reasons to work passionately for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime, yet few to compel Martov to share in the government of backward semi-feudal Russia after the fall of the Tsar. Martov's deep alienation from his Russian environment and his belief about it had made Martov into that rare phenomenon, a genuinely dedicated and experienced revolutionary who would yet refuse real opportunities of power if they were offered in wrong times and circumstances. Precisely because Martov was so intelligent, honest, and indifferent to power, Martov perceived clearly the permanent dilemma and predicament of Russian social democracy. Quote, the theoretical reconciliation of revolutionary democratic with socialist tasks representing two distinct historical trends and their tactical coordination on the basis of that theoretical reconciliation, such is the riddle which the political fate of Russian society has posed to Russian social democracy. End quote. Martov. Trotsky's solution was, quote, permanent revolution. Revolution in the advanced West should create conditions in which the, quote, two historical trends, end quote, could be drawn together and fused in Russia. Quote, were Russia to stand all her own in the world, end quote, Trotsky told his Menshevik critics in 1917, quote, then Martov's reasoning, bracket, that Russia was not ripe yet for socialism, end bracket, was correct, end quote. Trotsky. Lenin's solution, after some hesitation and with less than Trotsky's faith in Western revolution, was eventually to rely on the power of the party state to obliterate the dilemma. Quote, if for the construction of socialism a certain level of culture is required, why should it not be permissible for us to begin by seizing the revolutionary means, the preconditions for that certain level, and then afterwards, on the basis of the workers' and peasants' state power and the Soviet order, advance further and catch up on the other, bracket, Western, end bracket, nations, end quote. Lenin. To Martov, reconciliation meant that, placed as it was in the absolutist semi-feudal Russia, social democracy needed to combine a number of functions. As in the West, it needed to be in the first place a class party of the proletariat representing the interest of that class, and this certainly included the improvement of its economic and social, as well as its educational and moral condition, by way of trade unions, cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and all sorts of workers' associations. It needed to be also a party of political revolution committed to the overthrow of Tsarism and a democratic party which aimed to replace Tsarism by a democratic republic, and finally and above all it needed to be a party of social revolution, its major objective being the construction, in due historical season, of a socialist order. What distinguished Martov from Lenin and Trotsky, and even from Plekhanov, was that he took all these commitments seriously. He was a fervent revolutionary pledged to the overthrow of that Tsarist regime, which Martov profoundly hated. Ever since his conversion to Marxism and his revolutionary apprenticeship as a, quote, practical man in Vilna and Petersburg, and especially since 1903 when he began to, quote, fence himself off, end quote, from Lenin's elitism, Martov regarded the RSDRP as the class party of the proletariat, with the obligation to draw in the working masses and not merely to use the working masses for the purpose of revolution making. Even during the Iskra period when, in Martov's article Always in a Minority, Martov had come closest to Lenin's elitism, Martov never went as far as Lenin in making a virtue out of the necessity of the conspiratorial party which Tsarist conditions had imposed. Martov was a Democrat. First, by temperament, Martov rejected instinctively all the mannerisms and poses of the leader or quote, pompadour, and shunned the pathos of distance in his direct and natural relations with the rank and file. AI Overview says the pathos of distance is a concept in Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy that describes a drive that involves contempt and disgust. Pathos of distance is a virtue that can motivate self-overcoming and looking down on others. Back to the text. Martov was a Democrat also in his political principles and practice. It was Martov who in 1905 urged the thorough democratization of the party to the point of introducing the elective principle into all party organizations. Though Martov was a firm upholder of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Martov certainly took for granted the democratic interpretation which saw the dictatorship of the proletariat, like the Paris Commune, as the dictatorship of the overwhelming majority over an isolated capitalist bourgeoisie. Footnote. In 1907, Martov urged the PPS, Levitsa, to underline in its program the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat. End footnote. Even in 1918-20, when Martov accepted the Soviet system and the Soviet system's clipped labor democracy, Martov accepted the Soviet system only as a fact of life and worked to develop the Soviet system as a means of transition from the Bolshevik minority dictatorship to a fully democratic regime. Martov was also a real socialist. Martov rejected the capitalist system and bourgeois society not only as outmoded and irrational, but also as immoral and wrong. Some of Martov's finest writings, e.g. his, quote, Gibel, Titanica, The Tragedy of the Titanic, or Martov's On the Use of Christian Blood, is inspired by Martov's outrage and disgust at bourgeois hypocrisy and capitalist greed, and by his sympathy with its victims. Yet even in the advanced countries of the West, where the working classes were already, or were expected to become, majorities of the population, it was not always a simple matter. As Jules Getzler in the Dreyfus Affair had shown, to reconcile the democratic and the socialist commitments of social democracy. To some extent, the, quote, revisionist and, quote, Millerandist controversy reflected that problem. In backward rural Russia, with its very small working class, it was a heroic undertaking for a Marxist social democrat who felt committed to all the elements of his creed to reconcile them in a coherent party policy and to resolve the tensions between the national, the political, the democratic, and the agrarian aspects of the revolution, all of which were needed to bring Russia into line with the West that advanced proletarian socialist revolution which even Europe had not as yet realized. Martov was an internationalist. This sometimes seemed to ease, for the Mensheviks, the dilemma that arose out of the Mensheviks' commitment to a narrow class party in a setting where a national revolution was on the agenda. They could regard themselves as representatives in Russia of international social democracy and as part of the international proletariat, but they thus forfeited their chance of being the national party of revolution. Many members of the democratic intelligentsia, equally fervent opponents of Tsarism, were unwilling to adopt the narrow class point of view of the RSDRP, nor was a potentially revolutionary peasantry likely to identify itself with a Western-type social democratic party of the working class. Axelrod's vague concept of proletarian, quote, hegemony in the Russian liberation movement, which Martov accepted, meant little more than an affirmation of the class independence of the proletariat in a national revolution. It did not imply that the proletariat should accept the responsibility of national leadership. To reconcile these aims and resolve these dilemmas, Martov adopted Plekhanov's theory of stages and its tactical complement, a socialist version of the, quote, self-denying ordinance, end quote, during the phase of bourgeois revolution. The Social Democratic Party and the proletariat must resist two distinct temptations to power. They must not try to seize power alone, like Lenin in October 1917, and they must not consent to share power with the bourgeoisie, like Tseretelli in May 1917. Yet it was one thing for a theorist like Plekhanov to formulate a theory of stages, but quite another for Martov to commit a revolutionary party to an active role in the overthrow of the old regime, and then oblige it to stand back and surrender power into the hands of the middle class, offering the workers only the consolation prize of limited local revolutionary self-government. The lack of political realism in Martov's, quote, self-denying ordinance, end quote, can be gauged from the fact that neither in 1905, had they been given the chance, nor in 1917, when they had the chance, were the Menshevik leaders prepared to obey Martov's injunctions not to join a provisional government. Martov's concept of bourgeois revolution was full of insight. Martov saw the possibilities of chaos or dictatorship that might follow any attempt to plunge backward Russia prematurely into socialism. He predicted the important oppositional and reformist role which the liberal bourgeoisie and democratic intelligentsia would play in 1904 to 1906 and 1916 to 1917. But for all this prescience, it was beyond him to devise radical adjustments to the party program, which would meet the practical needs of revolution while leaving intact its devotion to the international proletariat, to democracy and to socialism. It was a weak and unconfident alternative that he chose, to split the revolution into stages in such a way as to absolve the party from immediate responsibility for government. Worst of all, Martov was not only content to squeeze himself into the Procrustean bed of a class party of the proletariat, but also felt committed to the Bolsheviks as bedfellows. For Martov firmly believed, in spite of everything that Lenin had done to Martov, to his Mensheviks, and to the RSDRP, that Lenin stood, quote, on one and the same class basis, end quote, shared with him the major socialist objective, and was divided from Martov simply on questions of means. Where am I? Fuck. Alright, sorry. Thus Martov deprived Martov's self of the freedom to choose other partners and allies, such as the democratic intelligentsia, represented by Kuskova and Prokopovich, the popular socialists or the socialist revolutionaries. Moreover, Martov's, quote, partnership with Lenin in the RSDRP meant that Martov, during the period of 1906 to 1912, lost whatever opportunity there was to transform it into a genuine social democratic party of the working masses. Martov's constant squabbles and futile debates with Lenin, an unrivaled and ruthless tactician, narrowed Martov's vision and misdirected and exhausted his strength. Martov felt obliged to treat the Menshevik-Bolshevik feud as a family quarrel, while Lenin fought it like any other war. Lenin also used all his weapons, à la guerre comme à la guerre. I don't know if that means a war is a war or what. Martov, almost incredibly, neglected the best that he had. Though Martov seized with more indignation at the fresh act of Leninist perfidy, at every fresh act of Leninist perfidy, Martov would not choose the moral issue as his battleground. A victory on that ground would provoke the final break with Lenin, which he was anxious to avoid. Martov had his own red-handed scruples. as an implicated quote tough of the early Iskra days, but perhaps more important than either, to so resolutely consistent and intellectual, was the feeling that his hands were tied by the Marxist historical relativist view of morality to which he subscribed. Footnote: for a discussion of a possible distinction between Marx and Engels on the question of ethics, see Eugene Kamenka, The Ethical Foundations of Marxism. End footnote. Strangely enough, this man, who in his early youth had created Prilchensk and seemed all his life to have a modest, matter-of-fact embodiment of its ideals, was also an occasional but eager debunker of all notions of normative ethics in the name of a very orthodox Marxist moral relativism derived from Engels' Anti-Düring. Plekhanov's philosophical works and Antonio Labriola's essays on the materialistic conception of history. Martov joined battle with the populists in the late 1890s, attacking their subjective idealistic, ethical sentimental socialism, and championed an objective scientific, rationalist, non-emotional, and class-struggling socialism. Martov raised similar objections when some of the revisionists embraced a variety of neo-Kantianism. Footnote: see Martov's spirited attack on N. Berdyaev, S. Bulgakov, and P.B. Struve for their attempt to subvert the proletarian movement with ethics. End footnote. In later debate with a, quote, God-building Lunacharsky and with an aging Plekhanov, who at the end of his life abandoned his militant materialism and began to see some merit in Kant's categorical imperative and, quote, moral law. Footnote: see Martov's On the Threshold, a volume of criticism. End footnote. Martov again deployed the orthodox text Anti-Düring and Marx's letter of the 4th of November 1864, in which Marx assured Engels that the awkward words, quote, truth, morality, and justice, end quote, in the inaugural address had been, quote, so spaced as to be innocuous, end quote. Footnote: Martov made the most of this letter in his polemics with Plekhanov. End footnote. But this historical relativist ethic, with this historical relativist ethic's emphasis on class as the determinant of a given morality at a given time, gave Martov poor ground on which to stand against Lenin. If Lenin and Martov both professed a class-based morality whose supreme value is the advancement of proletarian revolution, then their debates must merely be about means. Quote, method was a field in which Lenin would usually win, especially since Martov was restrained in fact by scruples whose foundations Martov dismissed in theory. Martov's moral case had to be reduced to fit within the stipulation that, quote, the means must be such that they do not contradict the end, end quote. This was, of course, one field in which his consistency faltered. He could be stung to simple indignation. On such occasions, he would appeal to those canons of morality which filled his inner being, if not his Marxist mind. He might call them, quote, common decency, or the, quote, moral, legal consciousness of the popular masses, end quote. Martov. But in Martov's revulsion against utopian sentiment and bourgeois hypocrisy, Martov appealed to common morality all too seldom. Martov allowed his debate with Lenin to be narrowed down to questions of party role and organization, as if to give point to Bernstein's much ridiculed dictum, quote, "The final goal is nothing, the movement is everything," end quote. The debate began with the, quote, organizational question, end quote, in 1903, when Martov rejected the narrow party of, quote, hard professionals under centralized command, which had emerged from and now sought to perpetuate the, quote, state of siege, end quote. It continued from 1905 to 1907, when Martov opposed Lenin's, quote, putschist party, geared to insurrection and seizure of power, in the name of a broader democratized workers' party surrounded by mass-based organizations of revolutionary self-government during 1908 to 1910, when Lenin's underground party organizations engaged in theft, forgery, and terror, while Martov advocated preponderantly legal activity by a party modeled on German social democracy. During the period of the, quote, exceptional lulls, end quote, in the years 1912 to 1914, when Roman Malinovsky and Pravda set the tone for the Bolsheviks to become a demagogical party which appealed to the raw class instincts of semi-proletarians. Wikipedia says, Roman Malinovsky lived from 1876 to 1918 and was a prominent Bolshevik politician before the Russian Revolution, while at the same time working as the best-paid agent for the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. They codenamed him Portnoy, the tailor. Roman Malinovsky was a brilliant orator, tall, red-haired, yellow-eyed, and pockmarked, coat, robust, ruddy complexion, vigorous, excitable, a heavy drinker, a gifted leader of men, end quote. Back to the text. It was continued in Martov's struggle against Bolshevik dictatorship, adventurism, and terror, as Martov tried to, quote, straighten out, end quote, the revolution and recall it to social democratic principles. It ended only in 1922, when Martov at last began to write off the Bolshevik regime as a Bonapartist perversion of the revolution. There were two fundamental faults in this story. First, Martov continued as a family debate, what he ought to have seen, as Lenin saw it, as a street fight. Second, brilliant and fertile though Martov was in debate, there was one respect in which Martov was not fertile or flexible enough. In spite of the advantages of Martov's early partnership and later feud with Lenin, Martov failed to produce a fundamental social democratic critique of Bolshevism sufficient to identify and, quote, fence it off, end quote, forever as a perverse denial of proper social democracy. Martov's failure was apparent in the long series of revulsions and rapprochements which marked Martov's ambivalent attitude to Lenin. The orthodox, quote, scientific, value-free variety of Marxism, which Martov had received from Engels, Plekhanov, Kautsky, Labriola, and Ged, though it might equip him with a long view of history and a level-headed consistency in theory, still provided Martov with a poor weapon in the ideological battle with Bolshevism. Altogether, Martov paid dearly for the Marxist neglect of ethics. More than that, the tension between Martov's Marxist mind and Martov's moral being illustrates a fundamental contradiction between Marxism's claim to be a value-free science, and Marxism's motivation and vision, which are certainly ethical and humanist. There may, then, be some sense in the critics from the right who see in Martov and in Russian social democracy a tragedy not of indecision, but of dogmatism. Martov could not emancipate himself from his Marxist straitjacket. Though Martov did delight in describing himself as an orthodox Marxist, it was not as a doctrinaire committed to the Marxist text as if to Holy Writ. Censoring a Plekhanov who used quotations from Marx to justify his defensism, Martov wrote, quote, "A Marxist is under no obligation blindly to repeat every word which Marx uttered some 60 years ago. One can find as many particular errors in his political judgments as among those of any great and independent thinker," end quote. Martov. In a letter to the Central Committee of his party in January 1921, Martov expressed his doubts as to the relevance of Marxist economic doctrine to the post-war world. Quote, "The state of the world is at present so exceptional that it does not at all fit into our usual schemes of Marxist analysis. To infer the main line of development requires fresh scientific study, which would significantly add to and might possibly change the economic conceptions of Marx," end quote. Julius Martov. And what year was that? 1921. Martov was above all a revolutionary and Western-minded socialist. If Martov was addicted to orthodox Marxism, it was because that creed gave hope and scientific certainty of Russia's Europeanization and its integration into the mainstream of European development. Nothing could irk Martov more than what he described as the privilegium odiosum, which socialists in the West would grant the Russian revolutionary movement. When Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg took a charitable view of Bolshevik expropriations, quote, "Das passt für Deutschland," quote, "Das passt für Russland," end quote, or Merheim and Bauer condoned a Bolshevik dictatorship as, quote, "good for the poor Russian bears," end quote, Martov was beside himself. But Martov's happiness was unbounded when Martov saw the Russian labor movement fulfilling its promise. Quote, "Having for the first time made possible what during a century the best people in Russia could only dream of, the political Europeanization of this bastion of international reaction," end quote. Martov. To Martov, cosmopolitan, Jewish, and utterly alienated from the traditional Russia of the Tsar, the music, and the pogrom, Marxism was a rational, humanist, and European promise of redemption. It was also that, quote, "integrated social political worldview, ... that mold," end quote, which would convert the oppressed proletariat into an active political movement and force. It was not, as is sometimes suggested by uncomprehending critics, Martov's religion. It was something more to be treasured, harder to shed than religion. It was his science. Martov tried his honest best to apply it to the situation which confronted Martov in Russia. The outcome was Menshevism, that Marxist brand of revolutionary democratic socialism which was distinguished by a fatal underestimation of the importance of power. The prospect of assuming power and governing a post-revolutionary Russia appeared to Martov and Martov's Mensheviks at best as a tragic necessity. Hence they lacked the dynamism, self-confidence, and determination of Lenin and Lenin's Bolsheviks, who were a party geared to the seizure of power and ready to lord it over Russia. It is true that some Mensheviks were quicker than Martov in coming to grips at length with the problem of power. Tseretelli and Skobelev did join the provisional government, but only as junior partners, taking, as Trotsky put it, quote, 1/3 of the power and the whole of the war, end quote, while Martov procrastinated for 2 precious months before he shed his straitjacket and began to agitate for a popular front government. But they were all half-hearted or inexperienced or too late. However, they may explain or judge Martov's Menshevism. Those who ponder Martov's tragedy and that of the Russian Revolution will discover in Martov also a noble representative of another part of Russian history, that of the richly endowed Russian Jewish intelligentsia, often oppressed and always ill at ease in Russia, which nonetheless enlisted in the front ranks of the revolution and was destroyed by it. For Borikov's diagnosis of and Martov's insight into the predicament of the Jewish proletariat was also true of the Jewish intelligentsia. It too was a, quote, Prometheus bound, end quote. The end. Thank you for listening.